Throughout the Wholesome Halloween marathons, we've covered a lot of emotions when it comes to horror films. We've looked at disturbing horror, wholesome horror, fun horror. But now, it's time to just get real sad. Going down under for this one, Lake Mungo is a half found footage, half mockumentary psychological horror film from Australia. To give you an idea of the kind of thing we'll be looking at here, writer and director Joel Anderson once said in an interview about the film, "I don't think it's a supernatural thriller, I think it's meant to be an exploration on grief." And oh boy is it that! I'm not avoidant of covering horror that touches on hard subjects on this channel, but with Lake Mungo, it genuinely almost did not make it into the final cut of this year's marathon. Because while it's an incredible movie, and it really is one of my favourite horror films of all time, it also just makes me feel heavy. Like, I get to the end of it, and I'm like, oh god. Granted, that doesn't exactly sound like praise, but it really is, as that sensation demonstrates just how effective and evocative this film is when it comes to exploring a deeply unpleasant subject matter. In a way, it's cathartic. I watched this movie for the first time after one of the worst years of my life last year, and I think I kind of needed it, to be honest. But not in the way that it made me feel better in the moment, if you get me. It's not one of those films that'll turn that frown upside down and get you thinking about the beauty of life after a bad period. It isn't one of those films where there'll be a punchy moment of this huge release where you'll have this massive weeping cry and then come out of the other end feeling like a weight has been lifted off your chest. Lake Mungo is more like the kind of thing that when you're going through the darkness is gonna sit with you in it, be very real with you, offer no clear way out and say, listen, no distractions, we're just gonna endure this. And like, that's a difficult tone and emotion to recommend, isn't it? But it's also in its own way a very rewarding one, and one that this film pretty maturely navigates. The film begins in this mock doc format, exploring the recent loss and supposedly supernatural events that followed it of the Palmer family, the daughter of which, a 16-year-old Alice Palmer, drowned while swimming on a family vacation. The whole thing is shot and edited in a chillingly realistic way. If it wasn't clear to you going in that you were about to watch a fictional presentation, you could easily mistake Lake Mungo for one of the many documentaries that Netflix seems to commission on a near weekly basis. Despite releasing in 2006, it has all the trappings of the kind of modern, slightly sensationalist documentary styles of today, tapping into the aesthetics of those kind of morbid curiosity efforts that play out the true stories of the likes of kidnapping, murders and trafficking as though they are a sort of puzzle box mystery intended to be solved, before that even really became a hugely popular trend. Though it doesn't deal with a crime exactly, since Alice's death was seemingly an accident, it navigates this family with a kind of true crime lens that feels in line with the sort of stuff that's made now. Lots of talking heads over nostalgic home video, family photos and archival footage, occasionally gratuitous and graphic static images punctuating the ends of dramatic statements and held on screen to let the shock of what you're seeing sink in. It's an incredibly well realised creative choice that drags you into the narrative further. As the audience, this presentation makes it feel less like you're watching a movie unfold, but more that you've been invited to be a fly on the wall of the sad, broken lives of a family in mourning. A family who, I may add, feel like the most believably ordinary, normal people on Earth. The movie does the classic found footage thing of casting unknown performers so as to not spoil the illusion of reality with recognisable faces. In order to pull naturalistic performances from these actors, Anderson also cast aside any notion of using a traditional script, instead treating these characters like real people they were making a documentary on. Using a key outline of what was next in the story, Anderson would sit his actors down for interviews and give them questions to answer as their characters, which helps create an unscripted and naturalistic vibe to the whole thing. Because of this presentation style and its performances, it gives the grief that's central to the film's narrative much more gravity. It feels real, it feels lived in, it feels uncomfortably familiar. Grief as a subject in these days is well trodden ground in the world of horror. But whereas more traditional cinematic efforts often approach the subject with high intensity emotions, like in the screaming matches of Hereditary, visual flair like the glowing backlight of the sun behind the mother in Final Girls as her daughter's tears silently fall, or the manifestation of grief as a tormenting, all-consuming mental health monster or scenario such as the Babadook in The Babadook or the caves of The Descent. Here, grief is not represented with any kind of cinematic abstraction. Grief is not a monster. Grief is the monster, an all-consuming, omnipresent sensation of a general feeling of malaise and ennui that characters just don't know what to do with. Not to knock those films I've just mentioned, I genuinely love all of them and they're just taking a different approach to heavy subject matter and it's not an incorrect one, but I use them as a point of comparison to show just how different in its exploration of grief Lake Mungo really is from the traditional methods we use to explore the topic within the confines of a movie's runtime. We often depict grief in big things and big feelings, shouting and screaming and weeping and crying, and that's because it is a big feeling. But as anyone will tell you who has experienced a lot of grief, it's not always the sadness that gets you, it's the hollowness. This strange mix of guilt, regret, despair, loss, confusion, all feelings that are so large and overwhelming you just don't know what to do with them, all vying for the control and focus of your brain, to the point that the noise from each individual subgenre of sadness just swirls together in a kind of indecipherable grief soup that just feels like emptiness. Oh shit, that got heavy. Sorry, little bit obsessed with grief lately. God, there's no real recovery from this. Look at Mega Man. He's cute. There we go. Okay, we're happy now. I fixed it. While the family are in mourning over the tragic loss of their daughter, they start to notice strange things happening around their home. Her brother Matthew experiences unexplainable bruising. Her father Russell, a natural kind of straight shooter unlikely to fabricate stories, swears he saw her ghost. Eventually, Matthew sets up cameras around the house in an effort to capture this strangeness, and begins to piece together a collection of what seems to be images of Alice's ghost. Each of the family responds to the whole phenomena in their own way. Her mother, June, hopes to communicate with her in some way, stricken with the guilt that she didn't have a better relationship with her. June is keen to try and have a seance to try and reach out to Alice. Russell, though, who has been coping with the loss mostly by burying himself in his work, even though he claims and fully believes he has had an encounter with the ghost, is trepidatious to explore it further, as if scared to hope she could still be in his life somehow, and keeping the thought at arm's length, even though deep down he's probably desperate for that to be true. And at this point, I'm just going to have to get straight into spoilers, I'm afraid, as this film takes many unexpected turns throughout its narrative that I want to explore pretty much as early as its first half an hour to 40 minutes or so. So just be aware of that if you decide to keep watching. And if you don't and you're going to drop off now, just remember before you do that this month is Native Trans Lifeline. So please, if you're able to before you go, make a donation in support, or if you fancy it, buy a charity shirt at the button on this page and or the link in the description. So, as the film moves on, eventually Matthew reveals that he's been faking the images, which I think is such an interesting thing on the grief angle, because obviously it's a strange thing to do. And though it's articulated narratively as Matthew trying to present further evidence of Alice maybe even still being around to his father in the hope that they'll exhume her body and just truly confirm it is her that was found, his explanation of his motives are so scattered and confusing that I don't really take him at his literal word. Why would fake images of a ghost make his dad want to exhume the daughter's body after all? It's a very unclear and slightly nonsensical plan. For that reason, I read it more as a small way of keeping her alive somehow. As if, so long as she can be faked in these videos, then she's still a part of their life in some way. Her presence becomes something to talk about, not a topic to be avoided, which comes across, I think, more in his very telling line during his interview that's presented as just a throwaway thought where he says, "I guess just something is better than nothing." I'm reminded at this moment of the heartbreaking documentary Dear Zachary, the best film I can never recommend, which opens with the director trying to preserve the life of his murdered friend by interviewing those who knew him. I think Lake Mungo really taps into that sensation of clinging on to a person after they're gone, without overtly saying that's what the characters are doing. The revelation makes it more difficult, very much so, for June, who had been clinging to these images as her last little bit of hope, some element of Ali still left in her life. The film explores her feelings of guilt further, as we find out that June's own mother found difficulty communicating with her daughter, and this became a kind of generational quality passed down in the family, creating a continuity of strained relationships between people who really did love one another but didn't know how to communicate it. As the family continue to wrestle with their grief, Matthew, even though he has been the one faking the previous imagery, remains convinced there is still something in the house, which again I think subtly points to his desperation to cling on to some memory of her, and leaves the cameras running while out of town. This time though, when they check the footage upon his return, it really seems like there is something there, and recorded at a time when Matthew wasn't even in the area to fake it. This puts into question everything for June, who immediately goes back through all of the previous tapes that Matthew had faked elements in to see if there was something else they had missed. It's there she makes one of the film's most harrowing discoveries. We revisit a scene where on the left side of the screen our focus was previously directed, as it appeared to show movement from the supposed ghost of Alice, one we now know Matthew just faked using mirror trickery. What's interesting about this though is because the documentary format directed our attention to this shroudy figure, and we're leaning in to examine it and sort of letting our brains register the shapes and movement in the grainy haze, we are totally distracted and don't see the other figure. It's in this same clip, a clip the film has already shown us, the exact same clip, unchanged, that is present earlier in the movie, that June realises there is a man squatting in the dark in Alice's room. Their neighbour, Brett, in their house, in her dead daughter's bedroom. When I tell you that my stomach sank at this moment and I felt absolutely sick, I am not kidding. It's a frightening scene with very uncomfortable implications that you can only speculate on. The absolutely amazing part of the filmmaking here is this scare comes from the idea of this fear of a man in the dark of your private space that you do not notice, which is a terrifying thought all on its own, and were this the first time you were seeing the clip, it would still be a scary revelation for the characters and a frightening visual. But it's the fact that they've already shown you this earlier in the film, and you, in the audience yourself, do not notice the strange man in the dark. It forces you to kind of feel that terrible sensation of the revelation. You literally are shown this space and you're made to, just like the characters, skip over the man in the dark staring right at you, only to later be given the reveal after you've forgotten about it of, hey, do you know this guy was looking at you that whole time? Eye-widening stuff. It literally puts you in a position where he was there in front of you and you have to think back and come to terms with the fact that he was always right there and you just missed him. Ugh! Makes my skin crawl. It's too real a sensation, and it plays very cleverly with how it's edited to totally manipulate the point of focus for the audience. They have to put a lot of faith in that working. You know it's possible someone could catch that guy there the first time round, but in my experience from people who've seen the film, no one ever does. A spectacular moment of horror there. Naturally, this raises some questions, especially with the neighbour having basically fled after selling their house and moving elsewhere shortly after Alice's death, which retrospectively now seems very suspicious. June scours through Alice's room to find what he might have been in there for, and unearths a tape with very, very, very questionable content on it involving Alice, Brett, and Brett's wife, who Alice used to regularly babysit for. The uncomfortable contents of the tape bring into question how much the family, and even Alice's friends and boyfriend, really knew her. Did she feel isolated and unable to open up to them? It's a question that racks everyone affected with her loss with more guilt. A thought that maybe what happened might not have happened somehow. If only she could have opened up to someone, if only she hadn't felt so lonely or burdened by these secrets. Maybe that somehow would have saved her. June finds out that Alice had visited the medium they used to try and contact her before she passed away, another thing that had went unmentioned to her family. Similarly, June finds diary entries in which Alice describes these feelings of drowning and being dead, and in these dreams she calls out to her mother who can't see her or help her. Something that further alludes to her sense of isolation from her family, but that also, since her dreams are seemingly predictions of her death, suggests a fate for her where she stands in her house unseen, as if foreshadowing her existence as a ghost that will haunt the home her living body currently occupies. All of these combined goings on, the dreams, the psychic visits, the secrets, and the obvious trauma a young girl would be suffering from what went on with her neighbours, paints a very different picture of her death. Not as an accident, but as something else entirely, though we're not quite sure what. It's just everything is too coincidental. A distressed girl constantly dreams of drowning and dying, and then she drowns and dies? Something isn't quite right. I'm going to give you one last spoiler warning at this point, because we're coming into the closing moments of this film, and even though everything so far has been quite harrowing, what happens next totally matches the oppressively heavy tone of the film so far, but it's harrowing in a completely different way that I don't think many people will ever anticipate. And if you don't want this spoiled for you, it is, in my honest opinion, a defining moment in horror cinema, in a film that many people won't yet have seen. So although I know we've covered a lot of ground so far, and you might be thinking, well, at this point the spoilers matter, I know so much already. So this is me just telling you that, yeah, they matter, and there's something coming you might not want to know about before you've seen it. So just, bear that in mind. It's at this point in the film, some phone footage from a school trip that Alice went on at Lake Mungo surfaces from a friend's phone. In the footage, Alice can be seen engaging in strange behaviour, burying something beneath a tree and wandering off on her own. Desperate for answers, the family travel to Lake Mungo themselves to find the buried contents beneath the tree and unearth a plastic bag with some of Alice's possessions. Strangely, some of her most beloved items, and even her phone. It's at this point the film hits you with one of the biggest blows of existential horror I've ever seen on film. Earlier in the movie, Russell identifies Alice's body, which because of the drowning is bloated and disfigured. It's a striking image that sets the heavy tone of the movie early on, but it's one that by this point we haven't seen in a while. When the family find Alice's possessions, they charge her phone and check the files on it. What they discover is a terrifyingly tense clip of Alice wandering alone in the darkness. A figure comes towards her. Over the clip, we hear splices of Alice's conversation with the medium she met with, as she explains that she feels like something bad is going to happen, that she knows it's coming and she's not ready yet, but it's nearly there anyway. The figure comes closer. We start to make out its features. Just before it gets right up to the screen, the video pauses. A distorted, bloated face. Alice's face. Alice's dead face. It is never explained with any clarity how Alice saw what she saw, some kind of ghost of her future, but it changes our understanding of her isolation, of her dreams and distress, her sadness and secrets. Alice, for a long time before she passed away, was somehow confronted with the terrifying impending nature of her horrific death, and she spent the last moments of her life somehow knowing it was coming. I know I've already used skin crawling to describe a different kind of horror earlier in this film, but this is also skin crawling, albeit for entirely different reasons. I don't know what to even say, it's just such an absolutely terrifying concept, and it is executed in the scariest possible manner. How completely distressing, how truly harrowing would it be to have that encounter, to face your mortifyingly terrible impending death head on and just sit in the knowledge of it. Have it haunt you like a ghost, knowing that no matter what you do, it's just around the corner. It's with this moment that Lake Mungo becomes not just a film about grief, but a film about death in general, about mortality, about the loss of life, both from the perspective of those who experience that loss and those left behind. It tackles the subject of death head on in all of its messy, scary tragedy, offering catharsis not through an emotional release, but through a truthful acknowledgement, like it's addressing an elephant in the room. It's a terribly sad, genuinely scary, upsetting, and at times even distressing film, but in that way it is also strangely comforting. Having watched this while going through a period of grief of my own that I am still very much somewhat in the midst of and do not know if I'll ever truly be out of, it was a very difficult watch, but at the same time a strangely correct one for the period within which I watched it. It felt almost sympathetic or respectful even to the feelings I was having, not making any attempts to understand them by dressing them up in the dramatic visual language of performance in cinema, but instead just saying, yes, this is complicated and confusing and terrible. And more than anything, that felt honest. I will say though, the film does end on a less than comforting note. It is a great ending, it still has one last surprise up its sleeve, it's just that it's an affectingly tragic one. As the events of the documentary come to an end and all of the revelations come to light, the Palmer family feel they have acquired some semblance of understanding and closure and begin to believe that Alice has moved on, allowing themselves to move on too, and they opt to move out of their house and start anew. The final image shows them in front of their building in a family photo, in what could almost be a happy ending, until it is realised that Alice is still there, in the home, watching from the window. In her life, the family never knew who she truly was. The real Alice, an unseen, invisible presence hiding somewhere beneath her secrets. In her dreams, she was haunted by this feeling of being unseen, unheard, and unknown. And here, in the ending, the family have once again, unintentionally perhaps, and with the biggest amount of love for her in their hearts, created an idea of Alice. In their mind, she has moved on, she is at peace, and yet there she is behind them. And as the credits roll, we see recycled clips of footage from throughout the film, but our attention is drawn to the girl we never noticed. In all of the clips the family took where they were looking so desperately for an Alice that they had invented, they once again, just as in life, didn't see the real thing. Because there she is, in all of them. Unseen, unheard, and unknown. Told you this was a heavy one. Sorry. It is really good though. Promise. Awesome Halloween. Yay. And on that note, that is yet another episode of this marathon in the bag. I will of course be back tomorrow with another video, probably a lot cheerier this time, much as I will every day this month in aid of Trans Lifeline. So remember to donate if you can, or buy a charity shirt if you fancy it, link in the description. And I'll also of course be giving all Patreon money as well as any ad revenue for this month their way too. And of course, in non-charity news, there's also some other cool stuff going down right now. Firstly, if I'm still in the running for it at the time of this video's release, and if these come out in the order I think they will, then if that's the case, I am pretty far along. I am running once again to be this year's Face of Horror after doing really well in the 2022 competition, but not quite making it to the top. That said, with your votes this year, that could change. You get one free vote every single day, though you can buy more if you are so inclined, and doing so will support the B Plus Foundation in their battle to fight childhood cancer. Link to my voting page in the description. Secondly, don't know if you know this because I almost never mention it, but I'm actually a creative advisor on the next In Search of Darkness movie, which is on sale right now. This legendary horror documentary series on 80s horror is now making its first foray into the 90s decade with In Search of Darkness 90 to 94. And as an advisor, I can get you a special discount code should you wish to pick this one up. Discount code and link in the description below. Other than that, you know the drill. Please subscribe to my OnlyDans at the red button below. It really helps out the channel. Like and comment with your thoughts. And my Patreon link with a bunch of exclusives is also in the description with all of the other cool things. That's all from me, and I hope to see you all again tomorrow. It'll be happier, I'm sure. So, you know, Good stuff. Bye.